Hey everyone, we're thrilled to be with you for another episode of the Daily Grace podcast. And today is a very special episode because Crystal and I are here at the Adoring Christ Equipping Conference in Houston, Texas. And we are, for the very first time in the history of the Daily Grace podcast, recording with a live audience.
This is so fun because when we're recording, we record remotely and we don't see other people's faces. So to get to see faces and to hear, it's just such a joy. So thank y'all for joining us. And there are two people that I do want to thank that are here. They work very hard on our podcast. They are 2 out of the 3 men in this room, Andrew and Scott. If you have heard the podcast and you're thinking, wow, they sound amazing, it's because of these men. They work so hard to edit. And so Scott and Andrew, thank you for all of your hard work. And so we are sitting down with Corey De Leon. Did I say it right? Yes. Okay. She is the founder and director of Adoring Christ Ministries. And we're going to talk about women on mission for the Lord. So Corey, thank you for your passion, for your heart, for this conference. And we're excited to learn from you today.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having me. I am excited to be with y'all. And by the way, welcome to the Houston area. We're so excited that Daily Grace is relocating to Houston. And I think that Houston's going to be really excited to have y'all.
Yeah. Thank you.
Before we start talking about our topic today, which I know you're passionate about, equipping women to live on mission for Jesus, Corey, we first just want to know, what has been your favorite moment of the conference so far? I think one thing that I absolutely love about this conference is that it is shaped by women's ministers throughout the Houston area. And I love how we all go to church in different parts of the Houston area. And that's where we, fellowship and grow together on a weekly basis. But it is so fun to push pause and come together with the larger body of Christ for a weekend. Yeah, I think that's so unique about your conference. And I've seen that throughout the various workshops and events and keynote messages, how that's been incorporated in. It's been a real joy to be here and be a part of it.
All right. So to get us started, will you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us what led you to start Adoring Christ and the Equipping Conference.
Sure. Well, I live in Houston with my husband, Bobby, and he's the family pastor at our church. And we have a precious 11-year-old daughter named Jade. I am a graduate from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and an author and a speaker, and the founding director of Adoring Christ Ministries. And really, Adoring Christ was just kind of an overflow of what God was doing in my life. I'm 46 years old now, but I heard the gospel in my young 20s, and I had a radical conversion experience. And I did not know the Bible at all. Nothing. No, I knew nothing. And so I could not have told you what God was doing in my life, but I just remember all the changes that took place. I would have been able to tell you that I was once blind to God, and now all of a sudden my eyes were open to see him. And I was like a child in wonder of God, and I couldn't get enough of him. I couldn't get enough of his word. And my life started changing. Like, the more I saw him, the more I wanted to be like him in my attitudes and in my affections and my actions. But I couldn't tell you why this is all happening. Well, fast forward a little bit of time, and I went to seminary and started studying scripture. And I came across 2 Corinthians 3:18, which says, "And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another." And that was the first time I realized, oh my goodness, like, this is what's been happening in my life. And it's not just what's happening in my life, but this is the supernatural work that God is doing through the gospel in our day, that when a woman hears the gospel and believes, her eyes are open to see his glory. And as we behold him, we start becoming like him. So when I started getting invitations to speak at things and to write and publish, as you can imagine, it revolved around those concepts of believing Jesus, beholding him, and becoming like him. Well, fast forward 15 years, and the Gospel Coalition had started doing training conferences in cities throughout the United States. And so they were scheduled to do one in Houston in 2020. Now, that date means something to all of us because that's when COVID happened. And so the conference got canceled. They had invited me to be one of their speakers, and it had gotten canceled. And so after the cancellation, I was talking with them, the director, and she said, well, here's the deal. We have made the hard decision to cancel the training conferences, but if Adoring Christ would be interested in hosting one in the Houston area, I'd be glad to consult you along the way if you would like. Well, my ministry took about 2 months to really pray about it because, as you all know, so much work goes into a conference, and we were like, we don't want to do something God's not in. So we just started praying for wisdom, and within that time frame, Lifeway reached out and invited me to be a contributing author for their new women's study Bible. On our first conference call with the other contributing authors, the leader of the study Bible said, we'd like this to have an equipping element to it. And it was hearing that again, that God just kept bringing that to me, that I felt called to take some steps out. I really didn't know where to begin in stepping out. And so that week I was in my devotional in Proverbs, and it said, through many advisors, your plans will succeed. So we said, let's reach out to the women's ministers in the Houston area, some of the larger churches and diverse churches, and see if they'd be interested in an equipping conference. And as we did, it was just like unanimous, yes, 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 yes. And so it just made sense to invite all these women, like, do you want to be on a think tank team and help shape it from the perspective of the boots on the ground?
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And I think it's helpful to hear stories like that, because I think we hear women say, hey, like God is going to use you to advance his kingdom. And we hear women say things like, hey, the gospel is transformative. But then you're putting these together and saying, hey, here's my story of how God has actually been doing in my life. And that's always so encouraging for us to hear. So I want to get down to our topic, which is equipping women to live on mission for Jesus. Let's break this down just a little bit and define it for everyone listening. What does it mean to join Jesus on mission?
Well, I love that question, because I'm sure you guys would agree that none of us have met the woman who enjoys a purposeless life, right? Like none of us have met the woman that's like, I just love not having a purpose, right? Like, but we have all been the woman who aches to understand our purpose. And Paul tells us in Philippians what our purpose is to know Jesus and become like him. I mean, hello, right? It is the most thrilling, purpose-filled life to know Jesus and become like him. Well, one of the ways we know him and become like him is living on mission. Why? Well, because Jesus told us that the Father is always at work. And when we see Jesus in the Gospels, what's the first thing he's doing? He's calling disciples. He's showing them his wonders. He's teaching them how to become like him, right? So when we're united to Christ, we enter into this purpose-filled life, and a huge aspect of knowing Jesus and becoming like him is being a woman on mission.
Okay, so that is interesting because, yeah, most of us would not be like content with feeling aimless and purposeless, but there are a lot of obstacles that I think that women face. And so why do you think it's difficult for women to really step out, live on mission? And what are some of those challenges that you think women are facing today?
I think two of the main things that just having 2 years under my belt with this equipping conference, I think two things that I've noticed women struggle with is, number one, I don't know who to begin starting to impact. And number two, I don't really know how.
So what would you say to a woman who comes to you and is like, Corey, I'm ready, but I don't know who and I don't know how?
Yeah. I mean, so that's why we like to use the language of, hey, let us equip you to reach the people in your life, in your homes, in your neighborhoods, in your schools, right? That to just start with the people God has put in your life. Again, if you look at the Gospels, it's really beautiful how, a lot of the disciples were brothers. Right? Like, I've met the Messiah, and goes and tells his brother, right? Like, we start with the people in our lives. And that's why we use that language.
Yeah. So when women get started, what do you find, like, are there more barriers that they encounter once they first get started?
I think the how-to, right? And so that's one reason we're excited about this conference and bringing in people like you guys, is to just give people tips and tools on how to start discipling their children, how to start a Bible study in your workplace, like how to start a Bible study in your neighborhood, like how do you share the gospel? Wait, let's go before that. How do you even have a spiritual conversation? Like, start a spiritual conversation, right? Like, and so I think, equipping people is what we're passionate about doing. And we work really hard that our messages are simple. I think sometimes we think as speakers and teachers that it has to be this profound message. And I think some of our speakers and teachers get really frustrated with us because we're like, bring that down 10 notches. Like, we want people to leave. You're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. We want people to leave being like, I can start this tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I think sometimes we just go too big, too fast, and people feel paralyzed.
I love that you're encouraging women to be on mission where they're at. Because I think we often feel like, okay, to be on mission means I have to go out there. I have to go do this thing. Instead of saying, what are the natural rhythms and what are the things that God's already doing in your life that you can now incorporate being on mission within the people that God's already entrusted to you? So what encouragement would you have for women that maybe are like, yes, I'm into this. I want to be on mission. I don't have time. Like, Corey, I have young kids. I have a job. I have all these things. Like, is there maybe some practical advice that you might give to those women that just feel like they don't have the time?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because we had a panel discussion this morning with the women's ministers throughout Houston. That was exactly the question we took on, is every season of life has its obstacles and its opportunities for the gospel. And I think the main thing I would say is just be creative because the opportunities are there. And so this morning we looked at singleness. Well, I think the biggest thing with singleness is we get beaten down, right? And discouraged because, we're looking for that man. And I think that's a big obstacle to singleness, is to remember that Paul says, no. From God, a season of singleness is a gift. So you can be devoted to the king and the kingdom, right? And so then we also looked at being married with no kids. And we know women struggling with infertility. And I think, again, perspective, we can get so beat down and kind of paralyzed by not having children, where we can reframe that and use that opportunity to really develop a missional marriage. My husband and I were married 8 years with no kids, and we poured our hearts into Young Life ministry, just loving on other people's kids, right? So, I wish we had more time to go through all the seasons, but I think just summarizing it, you just have to be creative to look at ways to overcome the obstacles and seize the opportunities.
Yeah, and I think we all have reasons to believe that our season isn't a good season to serve or to engage. But if we are never in a good season, then we'll never do it. And we know we're called to it. And so I think there's a point where we have to just say, Lord, I trust you. And I'm going to make some changes so that my life allows for this. We have to really make those schedule changes and orient our lives around living on mission, rather than saying I orient my life around comfort, around my happiness, and I'll live on mission if it falls into my lap, which, by the way, has never happened to me. I don't know if it's ever happened to you.
Yeah, I know. It's always just laughing when you're like, we feel like those good seasons. And I'm like, does anybody have those? I'm like, who's like, I'm in a great season? I feel like they're all hard,
Yes, every season has its challenges for sure. By the way, that panel was amazing this morning. I love just hearing the faithfulness of God in everyone's different seasons. Okay, I'm wondering, Corey, can you share a story with us about a way that you've seen God work through you as you've chosen to live on mission?
Yeah, I mean, I could go through each season and there's just precious moments in each, but I think just because it's fresh on my mind, I would probably just cherish with y'all my season in the fashion industry as a young single adult. So I just gotten saved, and I think I love how the Bible teaches that the moment a woman gets saved, 2 Corinthians tells us that very moment you are called and qualified by the Holy Spirit for the gospel ministry. And that's so exciting. And we see that in the Samaritan woman. She just went to the village and told everybody about Jesus and her testimony. And it says most of the village got saved, or a lot of the village got saved, right? And so that's so exciting. You don't have to be formally trained and equipped for the gospel ministry. The minute you get saved, you are called and qualified for the gospel ministry. But the thing is that's going to be your realm of influence. If all you know is the gospel, the 4-point gospel in your testimony, that will be your realm of influence, right? I could be part of God saving a lot of people in the fashion industry with those two things. I could have never led a citywide equipping conference with those two things, right? The book of Hebrews tells us, don't be spiritually sluggish. Move on from milk to meat, right? Grow in the knowledge of God. And the more we grow in knowing our Savior and adoring Him, the more we'll be able to impact, right? Because you can't give what you don't know, right? And so in the fashion industry, it was just such a sweet season for me because all I knew is the 4-point gospel and Jesus. But I saw Him use that so powerfully. There was literally a revival in that place,
That's incredible. Yeah, I think something we're really passionate about is that, hey, theology, deep, rich theology and studying the Bible and knowing God, it's not just for pastors. It's not just for people in seminary or who coin themselves as theologians. It is literally for us all. And so I love what you're sharing there. I'm going to go a little off script here. Y'all are seeing the behind the scenes right now. But so we've been talking a lot about outward, what you're doing to live on mission. I'm wondering what's the inward journey between you and the Lord as you are doing these outward things?
I think just adoring Him. I mean, there's always Marys and Marthas, and I am a Mary. And so I think for the Marthas in the room, that's sometimes more of a discipline. For the Marys, it feels a little more natural. But honestly, I honestly can say any fruit or output in my life has just sprung from adoring Christ.
Yeah. We've also been talking about courage this weekend to actually do it. Have you ever felt like you didn't have the courage to maybe step out and live on mission? Or how do you kind of overcome that fear or hesitancy?
Again, I would probably attribute that to, I don't know, I feel like sometimes I don't have the best in the moment how-tos, because it's always like, well, I feel like Jesus just produces that, right? But I have lots of moments where I feel like a coward, a lot of those moments. But I feel like at those moments is where it really rubber meets the road for me. And I'm like, I can't sleep at night turning a blind eye or being a coward. And I don't know, maybe people are different. Maybe people can sleep at night, but I don't attribute that to me because I know what I'm feeling is cowardiceness, right? But I think to your point, sometimes it's an overflow of adoration. And I think sometimes it's like following your Lord. It's like, I think that probably is the answer I would come to, that there's a point sometimes where it's the joy of seeing Jesus. And then sometimes it's just the submission of you're my Lord. And maybe I don't feel like doing this right now. And I really don't even think it's beautiful that you chose me to do this right now. I'm not feeling the adoration right now, but you're my Lord. And so I'm going to follow you.
Yeah, I can resonate with that. I often tell people, they're like, how'd you get started in writing? I'm like, well, kicking and screaming. Like, I was like, no, really, there's someone else. Like, please choose anyone else. So I think a lot of people can resonate with that. And I think ultimately what you're talking about is just reading scripture and then being convicted and being transformed by that. And then that's like coming out in your actions and the way you live. One more question here. Like, most of us don't do what you do, Corey. Most of us aren't speaking and writing Bible studies. We're just living everyday lives. We're getting groceries. We're commuting to work, and we're cooking dinner at night. And so, like, what does it look like to join Jesus on mission just in our everyday normal lives?
Yeah. Well, I do want to dispel the myth that I do this all the time, right? Like, this is an annual conference, right? So I would say the most of my life, I too am just living that ordinary life, right? And I think the thing that's really beautiful about just coming together as a body and talking about these concepts, like, how do we do this together? How do we start this together? I feel like what I have found is so much of discipleship is in the ordinary, right? I mean, like, the annual conference is not the ordinary, right? That's once a year. And I think the ordinary is, and I think this is sometimes why we don't do it, right? Is it starts by just being intentional with the ordinary. So, making disciples and equipping people is like having a conversation with somebody. That's where it starts. And then that leads into having a spiritual conversation with somebody, right? And then that kind of leads into getting to know them and what are their hangups with the gospel, or maybe they've been hurt by the church, right? So you're now knowing, okay, now I can see where there's some misconceptions, right? And then that kind of in time leads to, hey, would you mind if I tell you what the gospel really is and what Christianity really should have been? And I'm sorry that you were hurt in that way, right? And then that in time leads to, hey, would you mind if I share the gospel with you? And then that it leads to like, well, would you like to, begin a relationship with Christ? And then in time that begins, if they get saved, hey, would you like to read the Bible one-on-one with me? Come over to my house, right? And then in time, you're in a discipleship mentorship relationship. So that is all the ordinary everyday life, right? And so that's what we've really tried to do here is equip people. Like, our workshop titles are how to have a spiritual conversation, how to share the gospel, like how to invite somebody to read the Bible one-on-one, Yeah,
and I like to, it's just, when we're talking about everyday life, that's something that we can grab onto, like, okay, I can implement that today. Versus sometimes we think being on mission is something really big that we have to plan for and we have to save for and we have to do all this stuff. But to say you can leave right now and be on mission. God has entrusted you with the message of the gospel and people in your life that you can go share that with. And so it's establishing those relationships. Yeah. And I think that's so key. So I think it's really encouraging just to hear like, hey, we can all walk out of here and be on mission. Yeah. Like, we all have been entrusted with the gospel, whether we've been a believer for 5 minutes or 5 years, 50 years, we've all been entrusted with the same mission. So I love that. Okay, we do have one last question for you.
Okay.
This is a question we ask every guest that comes on the podcast.
Okay.
So at the Daily Grace Co., we say the gospel changes everything because
Okay.
it truly does. That's
Okay.
really what we're talking about this weekend.
Amen.
So Corey, what would you say the gospel has changed specifically for you?
So yeah, I mean, everything.
I know. It's
I would
hard
say
not
it
to
changes
say it.
everything. I'm
I
just going
know.
to quote your tagline. I mean, I guess just to stay on track with what we're talking about, I'd say it really changed my purposes and my pursuits, right? So like I shared with you guys, I was out of college working in the fashion industry. I wanted to own my own retail company. That was my pursuit in life. And so one thing, the Bible teaches us is that when God gives a woman a new heart, that it has new passions and purposes, right? Which is amazing. And I was old enough when I got saved to remember those dramatic moments, right? Like when my daughter got saved at a young age, she probably doesn't remember that as dramatic, but I do. And I remember how strange it was when my desires started changing from wanting to clothe women with the glistening fabrics of the fashion industry to wanting to clothe women with the righteousness of Christ. And it was strange. Again, I was so new. I didn't understand necessarily what was happening. There was just a change. And for me, in time, it led to leaving the fashion industry and going to seminary and full-time ministry. But I can tell you, even if God had not called me to leave the fashion industry, I had a higher purpose, even working in corporate America, because while I was working with all my heart for my employer, I had a higher purpose now, and it was to be part of telling people about Christ in the fashion industry, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that many of us can relate to that, maybe at one point in our lives, or maybe we've just seen that grow over time. And so that's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Corey. It's been a joy to be a part of what you're doing with Adoring Christ and the Equipping Conference this weekend. And we're just so excited to see how God continues to use you to equip women to live on mission for Jesus.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been an absolute joy.
And thank you all for joining us today as we've been recording this live episode of the Daily Grace podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter to receive free resources related to the podcast straight to your inbox. You can click on the link in the show notes to subscribe. Until next week, come join us as we continue this conversation over on Instagram at Daily Grace Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.
Awesome. Thank you all.